The following presentation is not suitable for young children. Listener discretion is advised. This episode also contains discussion of self-harm, so take care. One afternoon in late 1998, a 15-year-old boy named Jonathan James sat in his bedroom in front of his beige-gray Gateway computer and booted up his 56K modem. While he waited for the modem to connect, he looked around his room. On his desk was a set of narrow sunglasses he bought at a local convenience store that he hoped would make him look like hacker Neo from The Matrix, which he'd seen 3 times already that summer. Behind the glasses was a signed picture of astronaut Mike Coates that said, "To Jonathan, dare to dream." He dreamed that night. When he finally got online, he knew that he only had an hour or two before his dad, Robert, came home. Robert was a computer analyst, probably the reason Jonathan had gotten into computers in the first place, but also competition for the internet, which meant that Jonathan couldn't stay online forever. Back then, only one person could access the web at a time. So, with a crack of his knuckles, he went to work. Jonathan wasn't online to talk to friends. He had way more important things to do today. His dad had been pissed at him for how much time he'd spent online, and was threatening to get him in real trouble if his grades started suffering. His dad might even send him to military school. And tonight was the night his quarterly report card was going to go out. He couldn't let his dad see his grades. Or at least, his real grades. He navigated to the Miami-Dade School District's website and went to the administration portal. New Superintendent Roger Cuevas had come to office hoping to fix inequality across the school system. One of his first initiatives had been to get the school onto the information superhighway and put grades online. So, Jonathan logged in, using Superintendent Cuevas's credentials. 2 weeks before, while he was in detention for skipping class, he installed a simple key tracker using a programming language C on the administrative computer. And now, he had a backdoor into the whole system. As he logged in, he looked out the window. His dad was home early. Shit. He scrolled using his beige trackball, while out front his dad fumbled with the keys. The page with the grades on it started to load, slowly. "Hey Jonathan, you there?" his dad called from the front room. "Yup, just in my room," he called back. Jonathan frantically changed the D's and C's in his card to all A's. He pressed submit. But just then, his door handle jiggled. Shit. Jonathan turned the computer monitor off and pulled out a magazine to pretend he was reading. "Oh," his dad stared at him, then down at the magazine. It was the October issue of Maxim magazine, with a scantily clad Rebecca Gayhart on the cover. You get your report card yet?" Jonathan nodded. "They're online." His dad grunted. "Don't let your mother see that," he said, pointing to the magazine, and then he walked out. Whew! He turned back on his computer monitor while his dad's footsteps went to the front room. As his dad settled into his office chair, Jonathan shut down the modem. He'd gotten away with it. That night, they'd celebrate Jonathan's good grades with pizza. His parents didn't know what he did online, but school seemed good. The phone company never charged them for extra time on the internet, and for all intents and purposes, they seemed to have gotten a golden child. But what they didn't know was that within a year, he'd break into the Department of Defense and force the grounding of key parts of the International Space Station. And they couldn't know that within 10 years, it would all end in tragedy. On this episode, a real-life Ferris Bueller, Janet Reno decides how to prosecute minors, and a mystery with life or death complications. I'm Keith Corneluk, and you're listening to Modem Mischief. You're listening to Modem Mischief. On this series, we explore the darkest reaches of the internet. We'll take you into the minds of the world's most notorious hackers and the lives affected by them. We'll also show you places you won't find on Google and what goes on down there. This is the story of Jonathan James. It might be hard to remember now, in the year 2024, how the 1990s transformed Americans' relationships with computers. In 1990, only 15% of Americans owned a computer. More likely than not, if they did, they were engineers or people involved in computer-specific fields. But by 1999, more than half of the United States not only owned computers, but were online, and came from a wide variety of backgrounds. Jonathan James's dad was one of those early adopters. Richard worked as a computer analyst in South Florida. He was a quiet man, more comfortable with machines than people. Sometimes he could seem off-putting, but it was mostly because he was to the point and believed in authority. He was one of those guys who followed the rules and was rewarded for it. He was happily married to the love of his life, Anne, and they lived together in a quiet suburban house in the town of Pinecrest, 11 miles south of Miami. And on December 12, 1983, their son Jonathan was born. They raised him with love. And while Anne was the primary caregiver, Richard would proudly rock young Jonathan on his knees while coding in the C programming language, or tell him stories about NASA, based not too far away in Florida. Richard had been a lonely kid, and he saw in little Jonathan a way to finally have a kindred spirit. He was thrilled when at the age of 6 in 1990, Jonathan started playing with Richard's PC, learning how to draw using MS Paint. Richard was proud of his son and thought that he was following in his footsteps. He gave him books on programming in C and spent hours at the dinner table explaining how circuits work, much to Anne's dismay. But soon Richard started seeing differences between him and his son. Richard believed in authority. He'd studied computer science at university back when he had to use punch cards to access the mainframes. His son, on the other hand, while technically brilliant, didn't have any patience. He was self-taught and would bend the rules. Richard taught himself to program using the beloved programming language C and lectured him on the importance of following the right syntax. But then Jonathan just ignored him and would write sloppy-seeming code that, while it did work, made Richard's classically trained engineers blood boil. And as Hurricane Andrew devastated the area in August of 1992, when Jonathan was just 11 years old, Richard was distracted boarding up Windows and Jonathan installed Linux on the machine. Richard was mad, but he needed a new computer anyway, so just let Jonathan have that one. But soon, Jonathan's computer obsession started to interfere with Richard's work. He'd gotten internet for the home shortly after Hurricane Andrew had come through, and proudly explained to the 12-year-old Jonathan how it worked. But within months, Jonathan had started to understand it a little too well. Jonathan devoured early internet culture. He browsed GeoCities sites, forums on Angelfire, all the rest. Then started diving deeper. Like a lot of other kids, Jonathan started staying awake later and later, because there was always more online for him to find. Richard or Anne stopped getting calls late at night because Jonathan was online, tying up the phone line for hours. One day, Richard got a phone bill from Bell South, which was astronomically high due to Jonathan's time online. Then he discovered Jonathan awake and on the computer at 3 a.m. This was too much. Richard had had enough. Richard lay into him. This kid wasn't just getting grounded, he was going underground. No more computer, no more programming, not until he could follow the rules. 13-year-old Jonathan didn't take that lying down. The next morning, when Anne went to go check on him, his bedroom was empty. Jonathan had run away from home. Richard was furious. Anne freaked out. He was just a kid. After a couple of hours, the phone rang. Richard picked up the phone and loudly called out, "Jonathan?" There was heavy breathing and muffled sounds of people on the other end. Then it hung up. The phone rang again. This time when Richard answered, after a pause, Jonathan, his voice cracking, asked to speak to his mom. When Anne picked up the phone, he told her he'd only come home when he got his PC back. Richard started to swear. Jonathan hung up again. But he'd left his parents a clue in the background. They'd heard a coffee maker go off in a busy room and shuffling of paper. So they drove to Borders Books down the street, where they found Jonathan hiding in the computer section, a scared thin face poking out of the sea of yellow For Dummies books. Richard was mad, but Anne talked him down. She was so happy Jonathan was safe, and she promised that as long as she was around, she'd take care of him. She made Richard promise to get less mad at Jonathan and extracted a promise from Jonathan to be on the computer less. After all, he was going to high school soon. He couldn't let his grades slip. But his parents didn't realize that Jonathan's time online had given him insight into how to get around all of their rules. Because while most of America was getting connected, people hadn't figured out how to keep information completely secure yet. So that night, after his parents went to sleep, Jonathan logged in, pressing a blanket over the modem to muffle its sounds. And the first thing he did was log into the admin page for their telephone utility company, Bell South. It wasn't as simple as going to bellsouth.net or whatever, but during some investigation, he'd found the page the billing department used, and without much work, figured out the password to get in. That night he went in and changed the records for his dad's bill. Richard didn't know it, but his unorthodox son, too young to even get a job, had just halved his phone bill. The next month when the bill showed up, Richard and Ann privately talked about how impressed they were that Jonathan had stopped going online all the time, which was weird since it still felt to them like he was on the internet constantly. But clearly not. Jonathan spent the next few days living like a teenage king. Richard and him fought. With their personalities, it was hard not to. But there was never anything on record to get Jonathan in trouble, so long as Richard didn't catch him on the computer late at night. Meanwhile, his grades seemed fine. They didn't think he had many friends, but his parents weren't worried. Richard hadn't had many friends either. Like father, like son. But what Richard didn't know was that online, Jonathan had friends. He'd picked a username that showed he was part of a society. He went by Comrade, spelled with a 0 instead of an O, and trafficked in late 90s internet culture. He loved LOL speak, spamming chat rooms and showing off simple Unix programs. He wasn't malicious or a hacker per se. He was just a smart kid who didn't want his dad to get mad at him. But he was also a teenager and could get bored easily. Summer break 1999, Jonathan was 15 years old and was excited by all the time at his disposal. School was over, and his dad was busy with a big project at work. His mom was supposed to be watching him, but she kept going on a lot of mysterious trips to the hospital. He kinda thought she might be pregnant. He'd seen her throw up a few times. So, with this time to himself, he decided to explore a little. He tried logging onto a webpage of the local newspaper, the Miami Herald, but didn't find anything that interesting. He then tried whitehouse.gov, couldn't get in. They had real security there. But that gave him a challenge. Could he get into a government website? The afternoon of June 28, 1999, he tried a series of sites, FBI.gov, CIA.com, the Pentagon, Congress, and none of them worked. But Jonathan was resourceful and very patient. He started looking at smaller agencies that might not be as tightly guarded. By around 3 a.m., it had taken hours. In the next room, he could hear Richard snoring and Ann shivering even though it was hot in South Florida that night. He thought about going to bed, but then he noticed something. The NASA website he was on, which was a total bust, had a directory of links. And one of them was for a nondescript sounding Defense Threat Reduction Agency administration. Jonathan made his way over to the site, checked out its source, and saw that it was written in simple HTML, easy for him to interpret and navigate. Inside the code was a link to an administration page. On the page, he found something very simple. An HTML page, not designed to be seen by the outside world. Definitely just installed by an IT department that didn't think anyone would care to look at it. Jonathan tried a username, IT. That didn't work. What about admin? That was a username. Now he just needed to figure out a password. Something that might be tricky now, where systems lock you out automatically after a certain number of failed guesses. But this was a simple setup. Jonathan could see that brute force would get in there. He set up a simple Unix program to try random numbers and letters to break in. He turned off his monitor and lay in bed, exhausted. He didn't mean to fall asleep, but the next thing he knew, he was awake. Richard was outside his door, mad that the internet was being used. Jonathan wiped his bleary eyes and yelled out that he was just finishing some homework. He'd be done in a minute. He went to his computer and turned on the monitor so he could log out. On the screen, a simple message waited for him. Welcome to Defense Threat Reduction Agency Administration page. Jonathan James, 15 years old, had broken into the Department of Defense. Now, what the hell was he going to do? Jonathan James was a 15-year-old living in South Florida in the late 1990s. His father, Richard, taught him how to use computers, but had trouble with how Jonathan used the web in an intuitive way of someone raised on computers. Jonathan, meanwhile, had developed a need to be plugged in, and had gone to greater lengths to avoid getting in trouble for always being online. First, changing his grades to make them look better, then lowering his family's phone bills. Now, in the summer of 1999, he'd stumbled onto something a little bigger than his local school district or a phone company. He'd found a way to get into the admin page of a group within the U.S. government, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA. The DTRA was a new agency, just established the year before. Following the end of the Cold War, officials in the Defense Department realized that a lot of their tools to stop large-scale attacks had been rendered useless. By the 90s, there wasn't the same threat of nuclear annihilation from the Soviet Union anymore. Instead, the more pressing danger was that a small extremist group would get a hold of weapons of mass destruction. The 1990s saw the rise of extremist terrorist attacks, from the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, Timothy McVeigh's Oklahoma City bombing, to the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system in 1995. New Defense Secretary William Cohen was scared by the rise of these smaller-scale attackers. They'd proven they could kill hundreds with fertilizer and other easy-to-find materials. What would happen if somebody like a Timothy McVeigh or Osama bin Laden could get a hold of serious weapons? Worse, the military wasn't set up to go after this kind of terrorism. Instead, they were built to ward off other big militaries like the Soviets, which weren't around anymore. So in October of 1998, Cohen set up the DTRA to specifically go after terrorists with weapons of mass destruction. Because their targets were so small and amorphous, the DTRA worked closely with the rest of the Defense Department and needed to be able to communicate across the whole government, which is a long way of saying that getting into DTRA's system was like getting into the back door of the entire military and government. Jonathan James didn't know it, but he just walked into a world of trouble. He didn't even know what the DTRA did. He just figured out that it was a government website he could get into. And in the way that drove his dad crazy, Jonathan didn't bother researching. He just dove right in. Early that morning on June 29, 1999, when Jonathan got access to the server he started snooping around, he found the Unix mainframe that housed everything for the agency, with over 1,000 employees spread across the world. Jonathan loved that they ran on Unix. He understood how the operating system worked. It was his dad that taught him how to use it. When he was 11, he'd replaced the entire Windows operating system on the family computer with a form of Unix. He was in his element here. So, Jonathan looked around this comfortable environment and started seeing big markers that the DTRA server had more than just some agency's materials he'd never heard of. There was a lot on there. And other agencies that he cared more about. He couldn't get into these other places, but he could lay traps for people from those agencies. He installed a backdoor to read messages sent through the server, with flags that would send him a message if there was anything from agencies he'd heard of. And there were a lot of messages, with a lot of info. DTRA read and intercepted military chatter, the State Department, FBI, you name it.
Holy shit,
he said to himself.
I'm inside the goddamn Matrix.
Using his username, Comrade, he posted screenshots excitedly in a blackout forum.
Be careful, Comrade,
one messenger responded.
Had some intense shit.
Jonathan knew it, but he couldn't stay away. He spent the next few weeks using his backdoor to get into even more government machines. As he later remembered, the government didn't take too many measures for security on most of their computers. By early August, he'd hacked into 13 federal servers, holding thousands of messages between DTRA employees and other agencies. And on the 13th machine, he found something really big. The source code for the newly launched International Space Station. That's right, the International Space Station. Jonathan looked over at his signed photo of astronaut Mike Cartwright. Richard had taken him to go see the astronaut a couple of years earlier. It had been one of the biggest bonding trips the two of them had ever gone on. Richard loved space, and while Jonathan didn't want to admit he had anything in common with his dad, he'd inherited that fascination with astronauts. Put yourself in his shoes. If you were 16 and just found the keys to drive the International Space Station, what would you do? He pressed download. He was going to dive in and figure out how the space station, ISS for short, worked. Over the next month, he combed through the code for everything from climate control to navigation and communications on the $3 billion a year station shared between all of the major powers on Earth. He was fascinated. Jonathan wasn't here to mess things up, kill or hurt people. He didn't want to blackmail the US government or ransom the astronauts' lives up there. He was just fascinated with how computers worked, and he'd found a computer system that was literally out of this world. He wasn't going to do anything about it, other than, well, maybe brag about it online. It's not like anyone IRL would really care. Or would they? Because while Jonathan happily browsed through the code in his sweaty bedroom in South Florida, an IT staffer in Virginia was about to make his life very messy. During a routine sweep, the DTRA noticed that messages were slowing down when they went through the 13 machines Jonathan had infiltrated. Not by a lot, but by a noticeable amount. The IT staff at first thought there was just a bug or some kind of routine problem with the machines. But after a few hours of clearing out memory, they found something strange. The flag Jonathan had installed to alert him if anything interesting came through? Following up, they found the back door. The IT staff tried not to panic, but this was something scary. The agency had been set up just a year earlier to try and stop unconventional attacks. Now, it looked like it was under attack itself. They told the superiors, and the DTRA jumped into action. They quarantined the machines, cut off the internet access, and copied every line of code and every trace of the hack. Back in Florida, Jonathan noticed he hadn't gotten a flag message from his back door in a little while, so he tried to log into one of his servers. He tried a different one. You know that feeling as a kid after you did something fun, only to realize you get in trouble that you did something wrong? Jonathan had a sinking pit in his stomach. Oh, shit. He closed the remote login, then turned off his modem. It was going to be okay, he told himself. He didn't do anything. This probably didn't mean anything. Servers go down all the time. Maybe there was a storm. Or maybe they changed things around. No big deal. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, but that sinking pit in his stomach knew. That night at dinner, Jonathan buried his face in the TV dinner his dad Richard had made, and ignored whatever it was his dad was trying to talk to him about, which drove Richard crazy. His son, who he saw so much of himself in, never listened, and this was serious. Jonathan's mom, Anne, was sick. Richard tried to get through to Jonathan, but he was too distracted worrying about the men in black from the X-Files showing up at the front door. Richard gave up, hoping that Anne would pull through, and there was no need to talk to Jonathan about it. But he did, and soon, Jonathan knew the truth. His mother had breast cancer, and wasn't expected to live very long. Jonathan went into a deep funk. His mother was dying, and he couldn't even do the one activity that had been giving him joy. His grades started slipping, and he stopped bothering to hide it. Not like Richard cared, he was distracted. The James family was going through a dark time, each of them retreating into themselves. One strange side effect of all this, though, was that Jonathan started seeing people in person. He befriended some of the stoners at school and self-medicated. Not a lot, just a little to take the edge off. Meanwhile, in Virginia, the DTRA was doing what it was supposed to do, reduce threats. They opened a case just like any other kind of attack, which in 1999 felt very strange. No one quite knew who should be in charge. The FBI? Internal DTRA IT? But after endless seeming meetings that stretched during the fall, they found out something important. The break-ins were all coming from a single computer, and even better for them, they could trace the IP address. That pesky identifier all computers accessing a service provider's network needs to have. The thing people use VPNs to hide nowadays. Jonathan was 16, and this was 1999. He didn't know he needed to hide it. When the FBI showed up to Bell South asking for the location of the IP address, they pointed straight to the James household. Huh? Richard answered the phone. Jonathan was still in school, and Richard was taking care of Anne, who rested in the other room. The FBI was on the other end. At first, Richard thought it was a prank. Why would the FBI be calling? But then they explained what they were looking for, and Richard buried his head in his hands. Oh my God, I've raised an idiot, Richard said quietly, then laughed. He explained what was going on. He thought this was something like when kids get in trouble for breaking into the park after dark. He just needed to talk reasonably to the authorities, promise to punish Jonathan, and the trouble would go away. And he would for sure punish him. But he didn't realize what kind of trouble Jonathan had gotten into. No one really did, much less the FBI and the DTRA. Cybercrime was still in its infancy, much less enforcement. And there'd never been someone so young as Jonathan charged. The FBI didn't want to push too hard, so they offered Jonathan a plea deal considering how young he was. If he wrote some apology letters and went under house arrest, he'd avoid anything more serious. But unfortunately for Jonathan, when they did a routine drug test, some of his self-medication showed up in his sample. For the first time in U.S. history, a juvenile was going to go to jail. Little did Jonathan know, his life was going to get worse from here. Early in the year 2000, Jonathan James became infamous for being the youngest hacker at the time to get jail time, at just 16 years old. He spent 6 months in jail for hacking into the new Defense Department agencies and downloading the source code to the International Space Station. His father, Richard, a computer analyst who taught his son how to code, was strangely proud. He told the Miami Herald that he'd been in computers for 20 years and he couldn't do what he was doing. He didn't do anything destructive. But after Jonathan got out of jail, he couldn't forgive his father for not protecting him, and worse, helping sell him out to the FBI. The father and son had fought before, but they'd always made up because of Anne, Jonathan's mother, who'd acted as a bridge. And when Jonathan was just 18, Anne succumbed to a battle with breast cancer and passed away. She left Jonathan a trust that included the family house. Richard moved out. The family couldn't come back together again. The double blow of jail time and his mother's death profoundly shook Jonathan. Over Richard's objections, he didn't go to college. He went on a birthright trip to Israel in his early 20s, but otherwise stayed at home. He didn't have any interest in working, but found ways to live off his inheritance and by keeping his expenses low. Richard didn't know what he was up to and worried about his son. But, like father, like son, they were both stubborn people. Which made the email that he got in May 2008 that much stranger. His 24-year-old son reached out asking if he wanted to get dinner. He wondered if Jonathan was getting married. The next day, though, Richard got a call from a family friend. The FBI had raided Jonathan's house and taken him in for questioning. There had been one of the biggest hacks in U.S. history, and Jonathan was a person of interest. Jonathan never had many friends, especially during this time in his life. But one person he did know was Chris Scott. Chris had a lot in common with Jonathan. He was just a year older than him, spent most of his time online, and didn't seem to have any interest in having a real job. Except unlike Jonathan, starting in late 2005, Chris started showing off a lot of money. One night after going to see V for Vendetta together, Jonathan asked how Chris had money. And that's when Chris told him about his friend Albert Gonzalez, aka Soup Nazi. And if you'd like to go back to episode 8 of Modem Mischief, you can hear our entire episode about the Soup Nazi. Albert liked computers too, though not as much as Chris or Jonathan. Chris didn't really respect Albert, but he was good at programming. And there were some weird, unsavory rumors about him, like maybe he was a snitch for the feds. But he had vision and saw something that they didn't. But he could use what smart computer-literate people knew to make some serious cash. Albert started a scheme he called Operation Get Rich or Die Tryin', and had brought in Chris because his specialty was wireless security. He figured out something ingenious and needed someone who could help. In 2005, Wi-Fi was starting to be everywhere, but people didn't realize how much sensitive information was flowing through it. Every day, millions of people use barely secured wireless networks to send credit card numbers, personal information, and more. Albert wanted to get some of that. So he started what he called war drives, where a group of guys would drive around Miami with their laptops open, searching for Wi-Fi networks that either didn't have passwords or with easy-to-crack ones. In 2005, with Chris in the car, they found a jackpot, a Marshall store on the south side that used weak security for their corporate Wi-Fi. Chris and someone else, and we'll get to this person in a moment, sat in the parking lot, laptops out, breaking into the Wi-Fi. After a few minutes, they were in. They installed a SQL script to automatically funnel all information from credit card purchases to them, first from the store itself, and then once the script had wormed its way into the corporate center, the whole company. Which meant that every time someone swiped a credit card at any Marshalls, the credit card information was sent to Albert Gonzalez. Not just any Marshalls, but the parent company TJX, which owned OfficeMax, Home Goods, and TJ Maxx. In July of 2005 alone, they downloaded more than 80 gigabytes of customer information from TJX. Albert sold the numbers to contacts in Latvia and Ukraine, mostly to the Ukrainian counterfeiter Maxim Yastremsky, who paid Albert millions. Chris alone got $400,000 from his role in Operation Get Rich or Die Tryin'. Over the next few years, Albert and his gang went on dozens of war drives and went after companies like Dave & Buster's and Barnes & Noble. Anywhere from 45 to 90 million people's credit card information was stolen. But in 2007, the Ukrainian contact Maxik, who had made over $11 million in selling stolen credit cards, was arrested while vacationing in Turkey. Turkish police turned over information to the FBI, and in early 2008, the government arrested Gonzalez. Then a few days later, Scott. Weirdly though, they only charged Gonzalez with the Dave & Buster's break-in, with no sign of blaming him for TJX or the others. When they arrested Chris though, the government found messages saying that Chris had gone on his war drives using Unix-based malware that enabled them to steal all that credit card info in the first place. Chris hadn't made the malware. Someone else, someone who Gonzalez called JJ. And who was one of Chris's friends, but the most famous teen hacker of all time, Jonathan James, JJ. The FBI searched Jonathan's house in May of 2008 and brought him in for questioning. While looking through the house, they found a suicide note and a gun, but didn't think much of it. Instead, they wanted to know if he was Chris Scott's JJ. They didn't have proof, so they let him go. But Jonathan could see unmarked cars nearby. They were watching him. When Jonathan answered the phone after he got home, he could hear a telltale hiss and an extra click on the line. His phone was being tapped. Hello? It was Richard, calling to check on him. Richard didn't know what to say. He'd been so excited to finally meet back up with his son. But now this. After asking how Jonathan was, Richard was at a loss. He finally asked, "Are they going to find anything incriminating that you've been doing?" Jonathan took a deep breath. His own father didn't believe him, just like he'd never really had his back. "No," Jonathan finally replied. On the other end, his father sighed, then started to lecture him about how serious this was. After a few minutes, Jonathan hung up the phone. They both felt distant from each other, frustrated at what wasn't said. That was the last time they spoke. On May 18, 2008, Jonathan went into his room, queued up an MP3 of the Beatles' Fool on the Hill, and closed the door. A moment later, a gunshot rang out. At age 24, Jonathan James killed himself. He left a note detailing his passwords and saying that he was innocent. But there was no point in fighting, since clearly the feds thought he was guilty. Gonzalez was getting off light. Chris had already left jail, which might be because they weren't pinning the blame on Jonathan. The feds must be salivating. In his note, he says, "If they could tie me to this case, I'd be like Kevin Mitnick times 10. Side note, for more about the notorious hacker Kevin Mitnick, listen to episode 3 of Modem Mischief. But with all this, there was no way he wasn't going to jail again. Hell, even his own dad thought he might be involved. The note ends with him writing, "My soul is dead, so I will look after the flesh. I am the master of this computer. For me, the gates will open." Still too young to run for Congress, Jonathan was dead. What happened? Had he even been involved in the TJX hacks? In May of 2008, Jonathan James committed suicide after being questioned in connection with the biggest case of identity theft in U.S. history, the so-called TJX hacks. 8 years earlier, he went to jail as the first teen hacker to serve prison time, and he didn't want to go back. He was convinced that the feds were building a case to blame him for the hacks, since as the former teen hacker, he was a great public face. He knew that Albert Gonzalez, the mastermind of the hacks, had snitched for the government before, and he found it strange that Gonzalez had only been charged with infiltrating one company, when he'd been responsible for dozens. And there seemed like a smoking gun pointed towards him. His friend Chris Scott had broken into TJX along with someone they called JJ, who specialized in Unix. How many other 20-something hackers who used Unix named JJ were there anyway? Well, Stephen Watt, 24, met Albert Gonzalez in his senior year of high school. They bonded over computers and shared a love of weightlifting and trying to impress each other. Watt was reclusive, but a genius when it came to programming, especially Unix. During high school, he got a 4.37 GPA, while at night, he was a proud hacker who specialized in breaking into Unix systems. And his most famous alias? Jim Jones, JJ. In August 2008, 3 months after Jonathan's death, the FBI raided Stephen's work in New York. They found messages from Albert and started digging. Pretty quickly, it was clear that he was the programming genius behind all of this, not Jonathan. In December 2008, he pled guilty for his role and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And Albert might have cooperated with his former handlers, but he was still charged with TJX and other hacks. In 2010, Albert Gonzalez was sentenced to 20 years of jail time for masterminding the biggest consumer fraud attack in U.S. history. Chris Scott was sentenced to 7 years in jail for his role in the TJX attacks that cost the company nearly $200 million. If Jonathan had lived just another 2 years, he would have seen all the major players get punished for their hacks, and him in the clear. But instead, feeling all alone, he jumped to conclusions and impulsively cut his life short. His father Richard never had a chance to say goodbye or to apologize for being so hard on him all these years. And for all their fights over the years, it was always because they were so similar. Just two computer-loving men staring up at the night sky. I'm Keith Corneluk, and you're listening to Modem Mischief. And one other note, if you're struggling with mental health or feelings of self-harm, help is available. Call or text 988 now. Thanks for listening to Modem Mischief. Don't forget to hit that subscribe or follow button in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. And leave us a 5-star review there if you can. This show is an independent production and is wholly supported by you, our listeners. And the best way to support the show is to share it. And another way to support us is on Patreon or a paid subscription on Apple Podcasts. For as little as $5 a month, you'll receive an ad-free version of the show plus bonus episodes exclusive to subscribers. You can also support us through our merch store if soft tees, cool stickers, and comfy hoodies is your thing. Modem Mischief is brought to you by Mad Dragon Productions and is created, produced, and hosted by me, Keith Corneluk. This episode is written and researched by David Burgis. Edited, mixed, and mastered by Greg Bernhard, aka the Hamgregler. The theme song You Are Digital is composed by Computer Bandit. Sources for this episode are available on our website at modemmischief.com. And don't forget to follow us on social media at Modem Mischief. Thanks for listening.